The winter skies over Europe in 1944 were a battleground unlike anything the world had ever seen. Thousands of aircraft crisscrossed the frozen clouds each day, American bombers pushing deep into German territory, escorted by sleek P-51 Mustangs and rugged P-47 Thunderbolts, while the Luftwaffe fought desperately to stop them with whatever fighters they had left. By this stage of the war, the balance of power had tilted dramatically, yet one German machine still commanded respect, fear, and even fascination among Allied pilots: the formidable Focke-Wulf 190. To the Americans who had faced it since 1942, the Fw-190 was a paradox. It was fast, rugged, and could strike like a hammer, but it wasn't known for tight turning. In fact, for 2 years, U.S. intelligence briefings hammered the same point. The 190 cannot outturn a Mustang or a Thunderbolt in sustained combat. Pilots trusted that rule with their lives. They built tactics around it. They survived dogfights because of it. But in the final months of 1944, a strange rumor began spreading through fighter groups. A handful of pilots returned from missions saying the same unbelievable thing. A lone Fw-190 had turned inside them. Not outclimbed, not outdove, but outturned. It didn't make sense. It went against everything they'd learned in training and everything the intelligence officers swore was impossible. Most dismissed the reports as stress, misidentification, or simply bad luck. But one encounter, one incident over the icy forests near the German border, would force everyone to rethink what they believed. It involved an American pilot who swore the enemy fighter performed a maneuver no Fw-190 should have survived. What he saw that day would become one of the most debated dogfight stories of the year, and it began with a simple mission briefing at dawn. In late November, just weeks before the Battle of the Bulge would shock the Allies, the 352nd Fighter Group prepared for another bomber escort run. They were veterans now, confident in their Mustangs and in the edge they held over the Luftwaffe. The P-51 was the king of the sky, long-range, elegant, razor-sharp in turns. If the enemy sent out Fw-190s, the Mustang pilots knew what to do: stay fast, force the German fighters to turn, and use their superior radius to get behind them. It worked every time, or at least it used to. That morning, Lieutenant Mark Ellison, a young but battle-tested pilot from Michigan, strapped into his P-51 Sky Witch. He had flown over 60 missions by then and knew German fighters as well as anyone. He respected the Fw-190, respected the men who flew it, but he also trusted the statistics. He trusted the intelligence. And most of all, he trusted the Mustang. His confidence would be shaken within hours. Over the radio that morning, the briefing officer had repeated the standard assessment: if you see a 190 trying to turn with you, don't worry. Use your energy and stay calm. They'll bleed speed long before you do. That's how you win. Ellison nodded along like everyone else. It was a comfortable truth. It was a rule that kept the sky predictable. But as he taxied out behind the others, a cold wind swept across the field, rattling the thin canopy and carrying with it a silent reminder. Nothing was predictable anymore. The war was changing. Desperation made pilots do strange things, and German engineers had begun modifying aircraft in ways the Americans didn't fully understand. Far across the front, at a small Luftwaffe airstrip hidden among the pines, a German pilot named Oberfeldwebel Dietrich Kramer prepared for what might be his final mission. The Luftwaffe was collapsing, fuel was scarce, and replacements were almost non-existent. Kramer had watched his squadron shrink from 24 men to barely 7. Most were young boys with only a few hours of training. The veterans were exhausted, flying patched-up planes and relying on instinct more than doctrine. But Kramer had something different, a secret advantage. His Fw-190 had been modified by a resourceful ground crew chief, a man who believed that survival meant breaking rules, bending physics, and finding tricks no manual ever approved. What they had done to the aircraft was subtle, dangerous, and completely unofficial. The Luftwaffe High Command would never have allowed it, but in 1944, survival mattered more than regulations. The result was an Fw-190 that behaved differently, unpredictably. It wasn't faster, and it didn't climb better, but it could do one thing no Allied pilot expected. It could turn, not for long, not in a sustained dogfight, but for a brief moment, an instant that could mean life or death. That morning, as Ellison's squadron climbed into the pale sky, and Kramer's small unit prepared to intercept the bombers, their paths were set on a collision course. Neither knew the other's name. Neither knew the strange maneuver that would define their encounter. But within hours, they would push their machines to the limits, testing everything they had been taught. For Ellison, the sky would betray his expectations. For Kramer, a desperate trick would become legend. And for historians, the encounter would spark a debate still discussed today. Could an Fw-190 really turn like that? What happened that day would challenge assumptions, rewrite tactics, and leave one American pilot stunned by a maneuver he swore should have torn the German fighter apart. The story begins in the thin air above the Rhineland, where the clouds hid a secret, and where one impossible turn would change everything. The sun hung low behind the haze as Lieutenant Mark Ellison and the rest of the escort flight leveled out above the bomber stream. 80-plus B-17s rumbled beneath them, their engines beating a steady rhythm across the sky like a distant drum. The Mustangs spread into position, weaving gently to maintain speed. The air was quiet, too quiet for Ellison's liking. Dogfights never announced themselves politely. They erupted out of nowhere. It happened. A frantic burst of radio chatter cracked through the calm. Bandits! 10 o'clock high. Fw-190s coming in fast. The group snapped into alert, and within seconds, the sky transformed into chaos. Dark shapes streaked down from above, slicing through the clouds with the unmistakable silhouette of the German fighter, broad wings, radial engine, and predatory nose. Ellison pushed his throttle forward and joined the intercept. The first pass was a blur, tracers, distant explosions, and the roar of engines straining under sudden stress. The Luftwaffe pilots made their attack and pulled away, scattering into evasive maneuvers to avoid the escort fighters. Classic hit-and-run tactics. Nothing unusual. But then Ellison spotted something that made him narrow his eyes. One Fw-190 alone, diving hard but not escaping, leveled out below the formation. It was lingering too long, almost inviting pursuit. Skywatch going after that straggler, Ellison reported. His flight leader warned him not to stray too far, but Ellison had already begun his dive. He lined up behind the 190, waiting for the German pilot to do what they all did when pressed, dive away or roll into a shallow turn. But something felt off. The German wasn't running. He was watching his pursuer, almost gauging the distance, waiting. Ellison closed in. The Mustang's engine thundered as the gap shrank, 60 yards, 50, 40. Then, without any warning, the Fw-190 snapped into a violent brake turn, left hard, impossibly hard. Ellison reacted instinctively, banking his Mustang to follow. He expected the German fighter to lose energy within seconds, expected its turn radius to widen, expected the standard pattern he had seen a dozen times. But it didn't widen. It tightened. Ellison's breath caught. The German fighter was not only turning inside him, it was cutting across his nose. The American gritted his teeth, pulling harder, feeling the Mustang shake as the G-forces pressed him into the seat. This can't be right. He shouldn't be able to hold that. Ellison muttered to himself. But the Fw-190 held the turn. Not for half a second. Not for one desperate twitch. It held. The Mustang began to skid outward. Ellison felt his advantage slipping. His training screamed at him. This isn't possible. This defies the charts. The German fighter should have stalled, should have flick-rolled, should have snapped out of control. But it didn't. It clung to the air like something alive. And then came the moment Ellison would replay in his mind for years. The Fw-190 dropped its nose for half a heartbeat, just enough to regain speed, then yanked into an even tighter arc, an almost predatory redirection right into a firing position. The impossible had happened. Ellison was being outturned by a 190. He kicked the rudder, rolled right, and dove away just as tracer rounds zipped past his canopy. A second slower, and he would have been finished. As he leveled out, trying to steady his breathing, the German fighter did something even stranger. It broke off. No chase, no attempt to finish him. Instead, it vanished into the clouds, slipping away like a ghost. That move wasn't normal, Ellison said later. It was like the pilot bent the rules. What Ellison didn't know, and what American intelligence only learned much later, was that some Luftwaffe ground crews had begun implementing improvised modifications on surviving Fw-190s in 1944. Desperation breeds creativity, and the Germans were no exception. The modifications varied from base to base, but the most controversial was this: intentional center of gravity shift. By adjusting ballast, reducing ammunition in specific gun compartments, or even draining fuel from certain tanks, mechanics moved the aircraft's balance points slightly rearward. This made the fighter more unstable, dangerous in inexperienced hands, but dramatically increased its ability to snap into extremely tight, instantaneous turns. Not sustained turns. Not for long, but for 2 or 3 seconds. It could become a completely different animal. Old pilots described the sensation as riding a dragon's tail. Wild, twitchy, violent. But in the hands of an ace like Oberfeldwebel Dietrich Kramer, that instability was a weapon. He could force the aircraft into maneuvers that broke Allied assumptions. The trick was risky. Pilots could easily overpull and stall. Some did. Many crashed. But those who mastered it made the Fw-190 behave like no training manual predicted. Add to that another rarely discussed detail. Kramer's aircraft was partially stripped of armor to save weight, a modification becoming more common as supplies dwindled. Combine a lighter airframe with a shifted balance, and for a brief moment, the Fw-190 could pivot with startling aggression. Ellison had unknowingly chased one of the few modified fighters capable of pulling off such a maneuver, but he didn't know that. All he knew was the disbelief knotting in his stomach. He turned his Mustang back toward the bomber formation, shaken, replaying the image of the German fighter arcing across the sky with a grace no one had warned him about. "What was that?" he whispered. He would soon find out that the maneuver had a name among the German pilots. One whispered quietly because it bordered on reckless flying. And the next encounter would prove just how desperate, dangerous, and brilliant that tactic truly was. Ellison rejoined the formation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had looked directly into the unknown, something defying the careful rules of air combat he had been taught. He kept replaying the impossible turn in his mind, the way the German fighter seemed to pivot, almost float around the corner. The brief sideways slip, the savage snap into a perfect position. His squadron leader's voice cut through his thoughts. "Keep your head in it, Mark. We're not done." He was right. The Luftwaffe wasn't finished. As the bombers turned for home, the remaining escort fighters resumed their cover. Ellison scanned the clouds constantly, expecting another attack. The sky was quieter now, but quiet often meant the enemy was repositioning. And he was right. 15 minutes later, as the formation crossed over a valley filled with rolling fog, a single Fw-190 burst out of the whiteness behind the Mustang line, fast, precise, and aimed like a dagger. It was him, the same fighter, the same pilot who had performed the impossible turn. Ellison recognized the aircraft's markings instantly: a dark stripe along the fuselage, chipped paint along the cowling, and one wingtip stained with oil. Oberfeldwebel Kramer had returned. The German pilot went straight for the tail-end Mustangs, classic ambush tactics, but with a twist. He didn't climb after firing a burst. Instead, he rolled under the formation and pulled into another brutal, unpredictable turn. "Mark, he's yours," the squadron leader shouted. Ellison broke from the line and dove after the 190. This time he was ready. He expected the madness. He expected the trick, but so did Kramer. The German pilot threw his fighter into a shallow, climbing turn, baiting Ellison to follow. The Mustang closed the distance. Kramer glanced back once, then tightened his turn, again in a way the Fw-190 shouldn't have been able to do. But Ellison didn't fall for it. He kept his speed up, anticipating the snap roll trick he had witnessed earlier. At the exact moment Kramer tried to pivot inside him, Ellison broke upward, using altitude instead of angle. The Mustang climbed sharply, forcing Kramer to lose sight for a moment. In that tiny window, Ellison dove. The Mustang screamed downward, its engine howling as it sliced the air. He aimed ahead of Kramer, predicting where the German fighter would be once it finished its wild turn. The sky seemed to slow as he squeezed the trigger. Tracers burst forward, stitching a line across the clouds. But Kramer was ready. He jerked his aircraft into another violent jink, the kind only possible with a dangerously rear-heavy center of gravity. The Fw-190 wobbled, nearly stalled, but recovered at the last second. The bullets missed by inches. Ellison cursed under his breath. He had studied the enemy. He had anticipated the trick, and still the German slipped through like smoke. But the maneuver cost Kramer something far more precious: energy. The modified 190, for all its agility, bled speed faster than a normal one. Kramer's momentary advantage created a fatal weakness. The aircraft fell into a shallow, downward slope, losing the energy needed to climb or accelerate. Ellison saw it instantly. "This is it," he whispered. He pushed the throttle forward. The Mustang surged ahead. He dove again, this time staying high enough to maintain energy while shadowing the 190's path. The German pilot leveled out, attempting one last snap turn, his signature move, but this time the aircraft hesitated. It shuddered violently, nose twitching. The overstressed wings flexed. The center of gravity trick had limits, and Kramer had reached them. The Fw-190 fell into an uncoordinated skid. Ellison rolled in behind him. He fired a controlled burst. The round struck the 190's wing root. Smoke poured out instantly. The German fighter trembled, rolled, and began to descend. Ellison held his breath as he watched the wounded machine spiral. At first, he thought it was going to crash. But Kramer wasn't finished. The German ace fought the controls, leveling the aircraft just above the treetops. With smoke trailing behind him, he pulled into a shallow glide, heading toward a stretch of forest that opened into a small clearing. He made no attempt to continue the fight. No sudden turn, no final trick. He was simply trying to live. Ellison followed at a respectful distance, finger off the trigger. He knew the fight was over. In those final seconds, watching the damaged aircraft limping toward a rough landing, he felt something unexpected. Not triumph, but respect. Kramer's 190 touched down hard, skidding across the frozen ground and collapsing onto its side. The propeller shattered. Dirt flew, but the cockpit remained intact. Ellison watched as the canopy slid open and a lone figure climbed out, staggering but alive. Two men who had tried to outsmart each other in the sky now stared across a few hundred yards of winter air. One victor in a Mustang above, the other a survivor in the ruins of a once deadly machine. Ellison raised his wings in a silent salute. He didn't know the name of the man he had fought, but he knew he had faced a master. Back at base, when Ellison told the debriefing officers about the impossible turn, how the 190 had snapped inside him, how it nearly shot him down, many were skeptical. But his squadron mates backed him. And when intelligence units later examined captured Fw-190s showing unregistered center of gravity modifications and stripped armor configurations, the truth came out. Some German pilots had indeed unlocked a dangerous new capability in their fighters. One so risky it bordered on suicide, yet brilliant enough to turn a predictable aircraft into something ferocious for brief, decisive moments. Ellison never forgot the lesson. No statistic, no manual, no intelligence briefing could account for the creativity or desperation of men fighting for their lives. And through the years, whenever he told the story of the German pilot who bent the rules of physics, he always said the same thing. It wasn't the plane that surprised me. It was the pilot. The machine was just his paintbrush. And that turn, impossible or not, was his masterpiece.